Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Bernadette, for the kind invitation to join you at this year's Speak to the Future Symposium. And the basic aim of this event, which is billed as raising the profile of languages across all key sectors of UK society, is so fundamentally important, and particularly for all of us who are painfully aware of the general record of foreign language attainment in this country. There's a lot of work to do. Thanks for your kind of introduction, Bernadette. So I'm John Benjamin. I've been director of the Foreign Office's Diplomatic Academy since August, so just for a couple of months after returning from Ghana. I'm joined by a couple of colleagues. So Ian Felton, who is the head of our languages team at the Foreign Office, and Agnes Walker, who's our languages expert. So feel free to follow up with them during the break after this session. In my case, I've been a British diplomat for over 31 years, but a devotee of language learning since my very formative years, long before that. But I am a bit of a Foreign Office cliche in that I joined the diplomatic service with fluent French, German and Swedish, and I've pretty much never ever used any of those languages professionally ever since. However, I have been very fortunate in being able to learn Indonesian, Turkish and Spanish on the FCO's time and expense prior to postings where I use those languages daily and intensively as a core part of my job. And Spanish was the last of those languages which I acquired in 2009, in already my late 40s at that time, prior to becoming ambassador in Chile, which is what I did before I went to Ghana. And in Chile, I also acquired a Chilean spouse and son, as a result of which we now only speak Chilean Spanish at home here in London. So I hope I just about passed muster in such a distinguished linguistic setting as this. But I do also feel that a bit like living proof of the adage that it just becomes so much more difficult to learn a new language the older one gets. And so I think I've hung up my boots as regards trying to learn any more languages in the future. Just trying to keep hold of the ones I've learned in the past is difficult enough. Now, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the FCO, as you know, is basically there as the part of the British government that promotes the United Kingdom's interests overseas, supporting our citizens and businesses around the globe, promoting our values, advocating for the strengthening of a rules-based international system. And we do that through a large network of currently 274 posts in 168 countries and territories, including in multilateral organizations. And that large network is staffed by FCO staff, and the FCO is also responsible for running that global platform. But we also have many other colleagues from well over 20 other UK government departments who work on that platform overseas. So in total, we have about 15,000 people on that international platform, and about 12,000 or 3/4 of them are locally employed staff, and most often of the nationality of the countries where those posts are. And that global network of embassies, of high commissions, consulates, permanent representations, other offices is vital in helping the UK government pursue its international objectives. And we try to do that through our knowledge of different parts of the world, our knowledge of languages, of cultures, of political economies, and through diplomatic tradecraft, the skills such as negotiating, influencing, policy formulation, program delivery, and again, all in pursuit of achieving the goal of a more secure and prosperous UK in a more secure and prosperous world, while protecting British citizens overseas who need our help. Now, amongst our UK diplomats posted abroad, in any one year, we have between 500 and 600 operating in designated so-called speaker slots, which require a C1 or C2 level under the Common European Framework in the language spoken in the country where they're posted. And so in other words, speaker slots are diplomatic posts abroad where we consider real functional fluency is an indispensable requirement of the job, not some sort of desirable or optional extra. And that requirement for functional operational fluency applies to oral presentation, comprehension, and reading, especially less so to writing, as typically in our posts overseas we'll have native speaker local staff colleagues able to translate formal text to a higher standard than a non-native speaker could achieve. And they help us draft more informal work like social media posts, although I tweet regularly in the languages I described earlier. Once one of our colleagues has secured a posting which is designated as a speaker slot, they then enter a language teaching program with a quite specific course learning plan. And following that training, the person concerned, the colleague concerned, takes an exam based on specific work-based tasks. For example, speaking tasks involving negotiating an agreement, perhaps presenting a case, also listening to broadcasts about emerging political developments in a particular country, so that that simulates having to analyze a situation and report it back to London. And that also helps with a sort of, I guess you could call it area studies approach to language training, where the focus is, of course, primarily on effective linguistic acquisition, but the materials used, political, economic, media, and so on, also help the officer concerned by osmosis to absorb valuable preparatory lessons about the country and the society and the region they're about to go and work in. And the overwhelming majority of our teachers at the Foreign Office Language School are, of course, native speakers. Now, that general approach is something we consider vital because we need colleagues out in the field who can really get under the skin of the countries they're in. People who can communicate effectively with and influence key contacts on a very wide range of issues, and often operate in the local traditional and social media, something that over the last few years as a head of mission in Chile and Ghana I found myself doing on a daily basis. And you can only really do that by becoming highly proficient in the relevant language, even in countries where there is a high general standard of English in otherwise non-native English-speaking environments. And of course, in fast-moving crises, whether they're political crises or dealing with all the people recently stranded by the collapse of Monarch Airlines, for example, we need diplomats who are able to operate independently without having to rely on local colleagues to translate or interpret for them. So in other words, the picture I'm trying to paint is that foreign language skills are a vital part of doing diplomacy well. It's as simple as that. And that's why we have an extensive system of language training and testing to achieve those language learning goals. And it's why we invest quite significantly in it with a budget of over £4 million annually. And we celebrate achievement. So we're launching internally a Languages Impact Award to capture and celebrate how Foreign Office staff most effectively use their language skills in practice. Our most senior diplomat, our most senior official, who's called Sir Simon MacDonald, the Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office and head of the Diplomatic Service, well, he's a very active champion internally of language learning, particularly of our priority languages, and they are Arabic, Russian, Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, and French. Languages which he often points out cover up to 2/3 of the world in which we operate. Sir Simon MacDonald, he's an excellent German speaker. He was our previous ambassador in Berlin. Caroline Wilson, who was originally billed to be with us today, who's our Europe director. You can imagine as Europe director, she has one or two other issues to be dealing with at the moment. But she's a very impressive linguist. She's also the Foreign Office's language champion within Whitehall. She speaks Russian, Mandarin, and German. Our ambassador in Beijing, Barbara Woodward, is fluent in Chinese and Russian, and there are so many other examples around the FCO network of excellent linguists making daily and high-level use of their linguistic skills. So at the language school, which forms part of our diplomatic academy at the Foreign Office, we put particular effort into those priority languages. Again, I repeat, they are Arabic, Russian, Mandarin, Spanish, and French. We also have 6 priority 2 languages, which are Farsi, German, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, and Turkish. And we're building a very strong pipeline of speakers in those languages. Something we hope will be bolstered by the imminent graduate intake for this year of over 50 new Foreign Office colleagues, 70% of whom, I'm glad to say, scored very high marks in the Modern Languages Aptitude Test, or MLAT, which is part of the application process for joining the diplomatic service. And in the last year, we've delivered full-time language training, for example, to 43 officers in Arabic, 23 in Mandarin, and 11 in Russian. But beyond those priority languages, we do also, through our languages team, which Ian heads, provide training in up to 85 foreign languages. Though, as you can imagine, the demand for some of them is both low and pretty infrequent. So, for example, I don't know, randomly guessing maybe something like Slovenian or Burmese. You're talking really about, given that people typically do 4-year postings in those countries, maybe 1 or 2 people every 4 years. So the annual budget of over 4 million that I mentioned covers lots of language training. It's delivered both in our state-of-the-art language centre, which is in the Foreign Office building, which was formerly tragically closed in about 2007, but very happily reopened in 2013. But we also teach overseas in the form of in-country immersion training. Once a student has achieved operational proficiency, experience suggests that students make most progress if they do start here, rather than being immediately immersed in the language environment. But once they've reached basic operational proficiency, then they really motor on by being sent out to the country concerned. At any given moment, we have about a little over 200 Foreign Office staff on full-time language training. Other staff can undertake self-study at the language centre, including in the form of developmental classes at lunchtime or after work. We also provide training to staff from other government departments, preparing for posting overseas. We take part in a cross-Whitehall group on language training, including several other departments which have their own quite deep organisational and operational need for languages, such as the Ministry of Defence, with its network of defence attaches and serving military personnel posted overseas, the National Crime Agency, all the agencies involved in intelligence and protecting our national security. In the language centre, we operate either on a one-to-one basis or increasingly on a very small class basis, and which we believe brings real benefits. We have 3 outside providers on a commercial contract who provide services to us. So we have Language Services Direct, who provide all languages except French. The Institut Français in South Kensington provide our French teaching, and the Chartered Institute of Linguists set the exams that our language students have to take. Now, they're typically the time given to learn a language from 0 to a very high standard is relatively short, so it ranges, say, from 8 months for French to 22 months for Mandarin, but on a full-time basis. And it's important to stress that language training is not some sort of nice, relaxing alternative to a busy desk job. It's hard, intensive work in itself, not least because staff are firmly expected to take and pass the exams at the end, which are very demanding. And Anne Carlisle, was Anne of the CEO of the Institute of Linguists, part of the panel shortly, make sure that those exams are of a very, very high standard. I can testify to that, having had the daylight scared out of me by taking various of them over the years. And we're also ramping up the expectation on our staff in speaker slots that they must pass their exams. They're part of their appraisal of their annual performance. It will be based on how they do in those exams. And right now we have 72% of our heads of mission overseas in non-English speaking environments who have passed the target level set for them in the language relevant to the country they're in. And we're trying to increase that to 80% and more by 2020. So I could say a lot more about a language offer. Time doesn't permit me. I'd mention only that we do offer developmental training for officers to maintain their levels of proficiency after they've finished a posting, when they're no longer using the language in their daily work. And obviously, I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that in the case of the hardest languages, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, those languages where we basically invest 2 years in an officer and a large six-figure sum in doing so, there is a career expectation that they will serve in that part of the world 2, 3, maybe even 4 times in the course of a long career. We also provide optional training to help staff overseas who are not in one of those designated speaker slots, but who want to reach at least survival level in order to understand better the environment they're operating in, to get more out of the experience, frankly. So the bottom line is we have many colleagues out there in the British diplomatic network performing daily at a very high standard in numerous languages, engaging publicly and privately with the media, political elites, business communities, and many others to promote UK interests, including promoting our reputation as the UK as a world leader in the projection of what's become known as soft power. So I hope that's a useful summary of what we do at the FCO. Just to finish off, given that a theme of the panel discussion I'm about to join shortly, and of the whole day, regards the UK's place in the post-Brexit world, I hope a few words on that subject might be apposite. Bear in mind, please, however, that as a senior government official and senior servant, I'm not here to offer my personal views on the pros and cons of Brexit or to respond to any questions about how the government is handling negotiations, however much you try and provoke me to do so in any questions that follow. But I would say, speaking personally with regard to that overarching background that we're operating in, of how to work out what Brexit means, if the UK's global future post-Brexit is one of a country that's opening much more also to the rest of the world, and where our bilateral relations with leading European countries in a way become more important because we're a future non-member of the EU, then it ought to stand to reason, even if it's a bit of a simplistic assertion, that becoming proficient in languages should over time become more, not less, of a national priority. And at the same time, though, and again, for the sake of provoking discussion, not, I hope, an argument afterwards, I do wonder a little bit, though, if with regards to the approach to foreign language learning in the UK, the Brexit debate isn't also a little bit of a red herring. And I mean that in the sense that our national prowess at languages was generally perceived as pretty poor before we joined the EU 45 years ago, nearly, and now is still perceived as pretty poor. Despite those 4 decades and more of the free movement of people, of student exchange schemes such as Erasmus, and the whole panoply of millions of professional, commercial, and private interactions between British and other European citizens, we still nationally don't have a linguistic record to be particularly proud of. With or without EU membership, then, the UK seems to remain, sadly, on the whole, a stubbornly monolingual country. And I was struck very much by the way that one of the sessions later on today is called "Is Monolingualism Making Us Ill?" which is an interesting way of putting it. And that, of course, is despite the fact that in parts of the UK, in Scotland and Wales, for example, we have official non-English languages within the UK. Or the fact that here in fabulously diverse and multicultural London, we have over a third of the population who were born not only outside this city, but outside this country, and who between them speak literally dozens of languages as a daily reality. That's part of our daily lived experience in London, and yet, again, our national record is not one that we can be particularly proud of. I mentioned earlier that one of the languages I speak is Swedish. That's because I both studied it at university and then spent some of my formative adult years, early adult years there, working in a bank in Gothenburg. And I recall vividly now, over 35 years later, that actually the most difficult thing for me about becoming fluent in Swedish was not its inherent linguistic difficulty. And in fact, at the FCO, we rank languages in kind of 6 divisions of difficulty, and Swedish is in the lowest or easiest of those, that league table of language difficulty. But rather, the most difficult thing was the fact that such a high percentage of Swedes of all socio-economic, ethnic, internal, regional, and other backgrounds are taught to speak such excellent English. So my main challenge in the early days of my halting attempts to communicate was that people, Swedes, who I interacted with, colleagues, friends, would immediately switch unbidden into English rather than suffer through my initial childlike version of their language. And frankly, there's not too much of a risk that a foreign student of English in the UK falls linguistically short because the Brits they interact with keep switching into their mother tongue. It's not likely to happen. To put some figures on that, a recent World Economic Forum study suggested that around 2/3 or 65% of EU citizens aged 25 to 64 are proficient in at least one language other than their habitual principal mother tongue, with the figures for Scandinavia and Baltic countries into the 90%, nearly 80% in Germany, and around 60% in France and Italy. Now, interestingly, that same study didn't give a figure for the UK, but instinctively, I think we can all sadly guess that it's considerably lower. And of course, we have our domestic internal figures. We have the regular language trends survey. I believe there were some new Department for Education figures which came out yesterday, which analysed the recent A-level and GCSE results. And there's some depressing figures in there. I'm told that only 1% of all A-level students nationally last year took Spanish. Only 0.5% of all A-levels taken were in German. And at O-level, I'm giving my age away, GCSE, what used to be called O-level. The number of pupils entered for at least one language back in the year 2000 was about 70% of the whole cohort. But soon after that, 2004, I think, of course, languages ceased to be a compulsory national curriculum subject, and the figure for the percentage of the GCSE cohort entered for languages dropped to as low as 40% in 2010. And I think it's recovered a little since, but it's still very worrying. So events like this, and Speak to the Future's general efforts, are vital in restating the need for a revival in the teaching of and our basic national societal interest in teaching foreign languages as a key to understanding and interacting with the UK's partners in Europe and around the world. And as I hope I've described at the FCO, we regard language teaching as a key and indispensable tool for the way our staff are able to operate effectively in different societies across the globe. So you'll always find us at the FCO firmly supportive of your efforts to promote nationally the central importance and inherent value of learning languages, whatever our particular background or walk of life. So thanks again for this invitation, and we'll always support you in your efforts to proselytize more for foreign languages. Thanks.